CHAPTER23 THE projectile vehicle. On the completion of the Columbiad, the public interest centered in the projectile itself, the vehicle which was destined to carry the three hardy adventurers into space. The new plans had been sent to Breadwill and Co. of Albany, with the request for their speedy execution. The projectile was consequently cast on the 2nd of November, and immediately forwarded by the Eastern Railway to Stones Hill, which it reached without accident on the 10th of that month, where Michel Ardan, Barbicane, and Nickel were waiting impatiently for it. The projectile had now to be filled to the depth of 3 feet, with a bed of water intended to support a watertight wooden disc, which worked easily within the walls of the projectile. It was upon this kind of raft that the travelers were to take their place. This body of water was divided by horizontal partitions, which the shock of the departure would have to break in succession, then each sheet of the water, from the lowest to the highest, running off into escape tubes, toward the top of the projectile, constituted a kind of spring. And the wooden disc, supplied with extremely powerful plugs, could not strike the lowest plate except after breaking successively the different partitions. Undoubtedly the travelers would still have to encounter a violent recoil after the complete escapement of the water, but the first shock would be almost entirely destroyed by this powerful spring. The upper parts of the walls were lined with a thick padding of leather fastened upon springs of the best steel, behind which the escape tubes were completely concealed. Thus all imaginable precautions had been taken for averting the first shock, and if they did get crushed, they must, as Michel Ardan said, be made of very bad materials. The entrance into this metallic tower was by a narrow aperture contrived in the wall of the cone. This was hermetically closed by a plate of aluminum, fastened internally by powerful screw pressure. The travelers could therefore quit their prison at pleasure, as soon as they should reach the moon. Light and view were given by means of 4 thick lenticular glass scuttles, to pierced in the circular wall itself, the 3rd in the bottom, the 4th in the top. These scuttles then were protected against the shock of departure by plates, let into solid grooves, which could easily be opened outward by unscrewing them from the inside. Reservoirs firmly fixed contained water and the necessary provisions, and fire and light were procurable by means of gas, contained in a special reservoir under a pressure of several atmospheres. They had only to turn a tap, and for 6 hours the gas would light and warm this comfortable vehicle. There now remained only the question of air, for allowing for the consumption of air by Barbicane, his 2 companions, and 2 dogs, which he proposed taking with him, it was necessary to renew the air of the projectile. Now air consists principally of 21 parts of oxygen and 79 of nitrogen. The lungs absorb the oxygen, which is indispensable for the support of life, and reject the nitrogen. The air expired loses nearly 5% of the former and contains nearly an equal volume of carbonic acid, produced by the combustion of the elements of the blood in an air-tight enclosure. Then, after a certain time, all the oxygen of the air will be replaced by the carbonic acid, a gas fatal to life. There were 2 things to be done then: first, to replace the absorbed oxygen; secondly, to destroy the expired carbonic acid, both easy enough to do, by means of chlorate of potassium and caustic potash. The former is a salt, which appears under the form of white crystals. When raised to a temperature of 400 degrees, it is transformed into chloride of potassium, and the oxygen which it contains is entirely liberated. Now 28 pounds of chlorate of potassium produces 7 pounds of oxygen, or 2,400 liters, quantity necessary for the travelers during 24 hours. Caustic potash has a great affinity for carbonic acid, and it is sufficient to shake it in order for it to seize upon the acid and form bicarbonate of potassium. By these two means, they would be enabled to restore to the vitiated air its life-supporting properties. It is necessary, however, to add that the experiments had hitherto been made in anima vili. Whatever its scientific accuracy was, they were at present ignorant. How it would answer with human beings, the honor of putting it to the proof was energetically claimed by J.T. Maston. "Since I am not to go," said the brave artillerists, "I may at least live for a week in the projectile." It would have been hard to refuse him, so they consented to his wish. A sufficient quantity of chlorate of potassium and of caustic potash was placed at his disposal, together with provisions for 8 days, and having shaken hands with his friends on the 12th of November at 6 o'clock a.m., after strictly informing them not to open his prison before the 20th, at 6 o'clock p.m. he slid down the projectile, the plate of which was at once hermetically sealed. What did he do with himself during that week? They could get no information. The thickness of the walls of the projectile prevented any sound reaching from the inside to the outside. On the 20th of November, at 6 p.m. exactly, the plate was opened. The friends of J.T. Maston had been all along in a state of much anxiety, but they were promptly reassured on hearing a jolly voice shouting a boisterous hurrah. Presently afterward the secretary of the gun club appeared at the top of the cone. In a triumphant attitude, he had grown fat. Chapter 24. The telescope of the Rocky Mountains. On the 20th of October in the preceding year, after the close of the subscription, the president of the gun club had credited the observatory of Cambridge with the necessary sums for the construction of a gigantic optical instrument. This instrument was designed for the purpose of rendering visible on the surface of the moon any object exceeding 9 feet in diameter. At the period when the gun club essayed their great experiment, such instruments had reached a high degree of perfection and produced some magnificent results. Two telescopes in particular, at this time, were possessed of remarkable power and of gigantic dimensions. The first, constructed by Herschel, was 36 feet in length and had an object glass of 4 feet 6 inches. It possessed a magnifying power of 6,000. The second was raised in Ireland, in Parsonstown Park, and belongs to Lord Rosse. The length of this tube is 48 feet, and the diameter of its object glass 6 feet. It magnifies 6,400 times, and required an immense erection of brickwork and masonry for the purpose of working it, its weight being 12.5 tons. Still, despite these colossal dimensions, the actual enlargements scarcely exceeded 6,000 times in round numbers. Consequently, the moon was brought within no nearer an apparent distance than 39 miles, and objects of less than 60 feet in diameter, unless they were of very considerable length, were still imperceptible. In the present case, dealing with a projectile 9 feet in diameter and 15 feet long, it became necessary to bring the moon within an apparent distance of 5 miles at most, and for that purpose to establish a magnifying power of 48,000 times. Such was the question proposed to the Observatory of Cambridge. There was no lack of funds. The difficulty was purely one of construction. After considerable discussion as to the best form and principle of the proposed instrument, the work was finally commenced according to the calculations of the Observatory of Cambridge. The tube of the new reflector would require to be 280 feet in length, and the object glass 16 feet in diameter. Colossal as these dimensions may appear, they were diminutive in comparison with the 10,000-foot telescope proposed by the astronomer Hooke only a few years ago. Regarding the choice of locality, that matter was promptly determined. The object was to select some lofty mountain, and there are not many of these in the United States. In fact, there are but two chains of moderate elevation, between which runs the magnificent Mississippi, the king of rivers as these Republican Yankees delight to call it. Eastwards rise the Appalachians, the very highest point of which, in New Hampshire, does not exceed the very moderate altitude of 5,600 feet. On the west, however, rise the Rocky Mountains, that immense range which, commencing at the Straits of Magellan, follows the western coast of Southern America under the name of the Andes or the Cordilleras until it crosses the Isthmus of Panama and runs up the whole of North America to the very borders of the Polar Sea. The highest elevation of this range still does not exceed 10,700 feet. With this elevation, nevertheless, the Gun Club were compelled to be content, inasmuch as they had determined that both telescope and columbiad should be erected within the limits of the Union. All the necessary apparatus was consequently sent on to the summit of Long's Peak in the territory of Missouri. Neither pen nor language can describe the difficulties of all kinds which the American engineers had to surmount, of the prodigies of daring and skill which they accomplished. They had to raise enormous stones, massive pieces of wrought iron, heavy corner clamps, and huge portions of cylinder, with an object glass weighing nearly 30,000 pounds above the line of perpetual snow, for more than 10,000 feet in height, after crossing desert prairies, impenetrable forests, fearful rapids, far from all centers of population, and in the midst of savage regions, in which every detail of life becomes an almost insoluble problem. And yet, notwithstanding these innumerable obstacles, American genius triumphed in less than a year after the commencement of the works. Toward the close of September, the gigantic reflector rose into the air to a height of 280 feet. It was raised by means of an enormous iron crane. An ingenious mechanism allowed it to be easily worked toward all the points of the heavens, and to follow the stars from the one horizon to the other during their journey through the heavens. It had cost $400,000 the first time it was directed toward the moon. The observers evinced both curiosity and anxiety. What were they about to discover in the field of this telescope, which magnified objects 48,000 times? Would they perceive peoples, herds of lunar animals, towns, lakes, seas? No, there was nothing which science had not already discovered. And on all the points of its disk, the volcanic nature of the moon became determinable with the utmost precision. But the telescope of the Rocky Mountains, before doing its duty to the Gun Club, rendered immense services to astronomy. Thanks to its penetrative power, the depths of the heavens were sounded to the utmost extent. The apparent diameter of a great number of stars was accurately measured, and Mr. Clark of the Cambridge staff resolved the Crab Nebula in Taurus, which the reflector of Lord Rosse had never been able to decompose. Chapter 25. final details. It was the 22nd of November. The departure was to take place in 10 days. One operation alone remained to be accomplished, to bring all to a happy termination. An operation delicate and perilous, requiring infinite precautions, and against the success of which Captain Nicol had laid his third bet. It was, in fact, nothing less than the loading of the Columbiad, and the introduction into it of 400,000 pounds of gun cotton. Nicol had thought, not perhaps without reason, that the handling of such formidable quantities of pyroxyle would, in all probability, involve a grave catastrophe, and at any rate that this immense mass of eminently inflammable matter would inevitably ignite, when submitted to the pressure of the projectile. There were indeed dangers accruing, as before, from the carelessness of the Americans, but Barbicane had set his heart on success, and took all possible precautions. In the first place, he was very careful as to the transportation of the gun cotton to Stones Hill. He had it conveyed in small quantities, carefully packed in sealed cases. These were brought by rail from Tampa town to the camp, and from thence were taken to the Columbiad by barefooted workmen, who deposited them in their places by means of cranes placed at the orifice of the cannon. No steam engine was permitted to work, and every fire was extinguished within 2 miles of the works. Even in November they feared to work by day, lest the sun's rays acting on the gun cotton might lead to unhappy results. This led to their working at night, by light produced in a vacuum, by means of RUHMKORFFS apparatus, which threw an artificial brightness into the depths of the Columbiad. There the cartridges were arranged with the utmost regularity, connected by a metallic thread, destined to communicate to them all simultaneously the electric spark, by which means this mass of gun cotton was eventually to be ignited. By the 28th of November 800 cartridges had been placed in the bottom of the Columbiad. So far the operation had been successful, but what confusion, what anxieties, what struggles were undergone by President Barbicane. In vain had he refused admission to Stones Hill. Every day the inquisitive neighbors scaled the palisades, some even carrying their imprudence to the point of smoking, while surrounded by bales of gun cotton. Barbicane was in a perpetual state of alarm. J.T. Maston seconded him to the best of his ability, by giving vigorous chase to the intruders, and carefully picking up the still lighted cigar ends, which the Yankees threw about, a somewhat difficult task. Seeing that more than 300,000 persons were gathered round the enclosure, Michel Ardan had volunteered to superintend the transport of the cartridges to the mouth of the Columbiad. But the president, having surprised him with an enormous cigar in his mouth, while he was hunting out the rash spectators to whom he himself offered so dangerous an example, saw that he could not trust this fearless smoker, and was therefore obliged to mount a special guard over him. At last, Providence being propitious, this wonderful loading came to a happy termination. Captain Nicol's third bet being thus lost, it remained now to introduce the projectile into the Columbiad, and to place it on its soft bed of gun cotton. But before doing this, all those things necessary for the journey had to be carefully arranged in the projectile vehicle. These necessaries were numerous, and had Ardan been allowed to follow his own wishes, there would have been no space remaining for the travelers. It is impossible to conceive of half the things this charming Frenchman wished to convey to the moon, a veritable stock of useless trifles. But Barbicane interfered, and refused admission to anything not absolutely needed. Several thermometers, barometers, and telescopes were packed in the instrument case. The travelers, being desirous of examining the moon carefully during their voyage, in order to facilitate their studies, they took with them Barr and Muller's excellent Mappa Selenographica, a masterpiece of patience and observation, which they hoped would enable them to identify those physical features in the moon with which they were acquainted. This map reproduced with scrupulous fidelity the smallest details of the lunar surface, which faces the Earth. The mountains, valleys, craters, peaks, and ridges were all represented, with their exact dimensions, relative positions, and names. From the mountains Dorfel and Leibnitz, on the eastern side of the disk, to the Mare Frigoris of the North Pole, they took also 3 rifles and 3 fowling pieces, and a large quantity of bowls, shot, and powder. "We cannot tell whom we shall have to deal with," said Michel Ardan. "Men or beasts may possibly object to our visit. It is only wise to take all precautions." These defensive weapons were accompanied by pickaxes, crowbars, saws, and other useful implements, not to mention clothing adapted to every temperature, from that of polar regions to that of the torrid zone. Arden wished to convey a number of animals of different sorts, not indeed a pair of every known species, as he could not see the necessity of acclimatizing serpents, tigers, alligators, or any other noxious beasts in the moon. Nevertheless, he said to Barbicane, some valuable and useful beasts, bullocks, cows, horses, and donkeys, would bear the journey very well, and would also be very useful to us. "I dare say, my dear Arden," replied the President, "but our projectile vehicle is no Noah's Ark, from which it differs both in dimensions and object. Let us confine ourselves to possibilities." After a prolonged discussion, it was agreed that the travelers should restrict themselves to a sporting dog belonging to Nicole, and to a large Newfoundland. Several packets of seeds were also included among the necessaries. Michel Ardan, indeed, was anxious to add some sacks full of earth to sow them in. As it was, he took a dozen shrubs carefully wrapped up in straw to plant in the moon. The important question of provisions still remained, it being necessary to provide against the possibility of their finding the moon absolutely barren. Barbicane managed so successfully that he supplied them with sufficient rations for a year. These consisted of preserved meats and vegetables, reduced by strong hydraulic pressure to the smallest possible dimensions. They were also supplied with brandy, and took water enough for 2 months, being confident, from astronomical observations, that there was no lack of water on the moon's surface. As to provisions, doubtless the inhabitants of the earth would find nourishment somewhere in the moon. Arden never questioned this. Indeed, had he done so, he would never have undertaken the journey. Besides, he said one day to his friends, "We shall not be completely abandoned by our terrestrial friends. They will take care not to forget us." "No, indeed," replied J.T. Maston. "Nothing would be simpler," replied Arden. "The Columbiad will be always there. Well, whenever the moon is in a favorable condition as to the zenith, if not to the perigee, that is to say about once a year, could you not send us a shell packed with provisions, which we might expect on some appointed day?" "Hurrah, hurrah!" cried J.T. Matson. "What an ingenious fellow, what a splendid idea! Indeed, my good friends, we shall not forget you. I shall reckon upon you. Then, you see, we shall receive news regularly from the earth, and we shall indeed be stupid if we hit upon no plan for communicating with our good friends here." These words inspired such confidence that Michel Ardan carried all the gun club with him in his enthusiasm. What he said seemed so simple and so easy, so sure of success, that none could be so sordidly attached to this earth as to hesitate to follow the three travelers on their lunar expedition. All being ready at last, it remained to place the projectile in the Columbiad, an operation abundantly accompanied by dangers and difficulties. The enormous shell was conveyed to the summit of Stones Hill. There, powerful cranes raised it and held it suspended over the mouth of the cylinder. It was a fearful moment. What if the chains should break under its enormous weight? The sudden fall of such a body would inevitably cause the gun cotton to explode. Fortunately, this did not happen, and some hours later the projectile vehicle descended gently into the heart of the cannon and rested on its couch of pyroxyle, a veritable bed of explosive eiderdown. Its pressure had no result other than the more effectual ramming down of the charge in the Columbiad. "I have lost," said the captain, who forthwith paid President Barbicane the sum of $3,000. Barbicane did not wish to accept the money from one of his fellow travelers, but gave way at last before the determination of Nicole, who wished before leaving the earth to fulfill all his engagements. "Now," said Michel Ardan, "I have only one thing more to wish for you, my brave captain." "What is that?" asked Nicole. "It is that you may lose your two other bets. Then we shall be sure not to be stopped on our journey." Chapter 26 FIRE. The 1st of December had arrived, the fatal day. For, if the projectile were not discharged that very night at 10h, 40 a.m., 40 p.m., more than 18 years must roll by before the moon would again present herself under the same conditions of zenith and perigee. The weather was magnificent. Despite the approach of winter, the sun shone brightly, and bathed in its radiant light that earth which three of its denizens were about to abandon for a new world. How many persons lost their rest on the night which preceded this long-expected day? All hearts beat with disquietude, save only the heart of Michel Ardan. That imperturbable personage came and went with his habitual business-like air, while nothing whatever denoted that any unusual matter preoccupied his mind. After dawn, an innumerable multitude covered the prairie, which extends as far as the eye can reach, round Stones Hill. Every quarter of an hour the railway brought fresh accessions of sightseers, and, according to the statement of the Tampa Town Observer, not less than 5 millions of spectators thronged the soil of Florida. For a whole month previously, the mass of these persons had bivouacked round the enclosure, and laid the foundations for a town, which was afterward called Ardan's Town. The whole plain was covered with huts, cottages, and tents. Every nation under the sun was represented there, and every language might be heard spoken at the same time. It was a perfect Babel reenacted. All the various classes of American society were mingled together, in terms of absolute equality. Bankers, farmers, sailors, cotton planters, brokers, merchants, watermen, magistrates elbowed each other in the most free and easy way. Louisiana Creoles fraternized with farmers from Indiana. Kentucky and Tennessee gentlemen and haughty Virginians conversed with trappers, and the half-savages of the lakes and butchers from Cincinnati. Broad-brimmed white hats and Panamas, blue cotton trousers, light-colored stockings, cambric frills, were all here displayed, while upon shirt fronts, wristbands, and neckties, upon every finger, even upon the very ears, they wore an assortment of rings, shirt pins, brooches, and trinkets of which the value only equaled the execrable taste. Women, children, and servants, in equally expensive dress, surrounded their husbands, fathers, or masters, who resembled the patriarchs of tribes, in the midst of their immense households. At mealtimes all fell to work upon the dishes peculiar to the southern states, and consumed with an appetite that threatened speedy exhaustion of the victualling powers of Florida, fricasseed frogs, stuffed monkey, fish chowder, undid and possum, and raccoon steaks, and as for the liquors, which accompanied this indigestible repast, the shouts, the vociferations that resounded through the bars and taverns, decorated with glasses, tankards, and bottles of marvelous shape, mortars for pounding sugar, and bundles of straws. Mint julep roars, one of the barmen. Claret sangria, shouts another, cocktail. Brandy smash, real mint julep in the new style. All these cries intermingled produced a bewildering and deafening hubbub. But on this day, 1st of December, such sounds were rare, no one thought of eating or drinking, and at 4 p.m., there were vast numbers of spectators who had not even taken their customary lunch. And, a still more significant fact, even the national passion for play seemed quelled for the time, under the general excitement of the hour. Up till nightfall, a dull, noiseless agitation, such as precedes great catastrophes, ran through the anxious multitude, and indescribable uneasiness pervaded all minds, an indefinable sensation, which oppressed the heart. Everyone wished it was over. However, about 7 o'clock, the heavy silence was dissipated, the moon rose above the horizon, millions of hers hailed her appearance, she was punctual to the rendezvous, and shouts of welcome greeted her on all sides. As her pale beams shone gracefully in the clear heavens, at this moment the 3 intrepid travelers appeared. This was the signal for renewed cries of still greater intensity. Instantly the vast assemblage, as with one accord, struck up the national hymn of the United States, and Yankee Doodle, sung by 5 million of hearty throats, rose like a roaring tempest to the farthest limits of the atmosphere. Then a profound silence reigned throughout the crowd. The Frenchman and the 2 Americans had by this time entered the enclosure reserved in the center of the multitude. They were accompanied by the members of the gun club, and by deputations sent from all the European observatories. Barbicane, cool and collected, was giving his final directions. Nicole, with compressed lips, his arms crossed behind his back, walked with a firm and measured step. Michel Ardan, always easy, dressed in thorough traveler's costume, leathern gaiters on his legs, pouch by his side, in loose velvet suit, cigar in mouth, was full of inexhaustible gaiety, laughing, joking, playing pranks with J.T. Maston. In one word, he was the thorough Frenchman and worse, a Parisian, to the last moment. 10 o'clock struck. The moment had arrived for taking their places in the projectile. The necessary operations for the descent, and the subsequent removal of the cranes and scaffolding that inclined over the mouth of the Columbiad, required a certain period of time. Barbicane had regulated his chronometer to the 10th part of a second by that of Murchison the engineer, who was charged with the duty of firing the gun by means of an electric spark. Thus the travelers enclosed within the projectile were enabled to follow with their eyes the impassive needle, which marked the precise moment of their departure. The moment had arrived for saying goodbye. The scene was a touching one. Despite his feverish gaiety, even Michel Ardan was touched. J.T. Maston had found in his own dry eyes one ancient tear, which he had doubtless reserved for the occasion. He dropped it on the forehead of his dear president. Can I not go? He said, there is still time. Impossible, old fellow, replied Barbicane. A few moments later, the three fellow travelers had ensconced themselves in the projectile and screwed down the plate, which covered the entrance aperture. The mouth of the Columbiad, now completely disencumbered, was open entirely to the sky. The moon advanced upward in a heaven of the purest clearness, outshining in her passage the twinkling light of the stars.